Shalom. In a day or two it will be Hanukkah, the Feast of Hannukkah, 8-day festival. So I decided let's have a look at Hanukkah. What does it mean for Christians? What does it mean for people who are not Jews? Does it mean anything to us at all? And well, I think it does, and I think it's quite important. And Hanukkah, the events occurring at Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication at the time of the Maccabees, they are in Scripture, but you must know how to find them. We have to start with the great image of Daniel 2, and it says, "You saw, O king, behold a great image." And then the image that the king sees is this head of gold and the shoulder of silver. This image was of gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. There's the belly and the thighs are of bronze, and that's the Greek Empire. You know, the golden head, that was the Babylonian Empire, the silver, that was the Persian Empire, and the bronze, that's the empire of Alexander the Great and of the four generals that continued that Greek Empire. And it's during that empire that the events of Hanukkah happened, the events of the Maccabees. Alexander the Great, commonly known Alexander III of Macedon, 356 BC till 323 BC, commonly known as Alexander the Great, was a king of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedonia. He spent most of his ruling years on an unprecedented military campaign through Western Asia and Northeast Africa, and by the age of 30 he had created one of the largest empires of the ancient world, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. He was undefeated in battle and is widely considered one of history's most successful military commanders. Well, is he in the Bible? Yes, he's in the Bible. He's not mentioned by name, but he's in the Bible, in Daniel 8. "I raised my eyes and I saw," verse 3, "and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the river." The ram, that's the empire of the Persians. "It had two horns," Persians and Medes, "and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last," the Persians. "I saw the ram charging westward and northwards and southward," the ram, the Persians. No empire, no beast could stand before him, and there was no one who would rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and magnified himself. And I was considering, behold, a he-goat," that's the Greeks, that's Alexander the Great, "came from the west, across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground." That means he came at great speed. "And the goat had a conspicuous horn," Alexander the Great, "between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the river, and he ran at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns." And verse 8, "Then the he-goat magnified himself exceedingly, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken." Alexander the Great, he died. "And instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven, and the four horns, the four Diakai empires, the Diakai kingdoms, and they were Hellenistic kingdoms, Greek kingdoms. The Diakai, the Hellenism says about that, Wikipedia says about that, the Hellenistic period covers the period of Mediterranean history between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and the emergence of the Roman Empire in 31 BC. So during those 300 years we have Hellenism, we have the Greek Empire. The Greek language word Hellas was originally the widely recognized name of Greece, from which the word Hellenistic was derived. The Hellenistic period was characterized by a new wave of Greek colonization, which established Greek cities and kingdoms in Asia and Africa. This resulted in the export of Greek culture and language to these new realms, spanning as far as modern-day India. These new kingdoms were also influenced by the indigenous cultures. Hellenistic culture thus represents a fusion of the ancient Greek world with that of Western Asian. The mixture gave rise to a common Greek dialect known as Koine Greek, which became the lingua franca through the Hellenistic world. And there were theaters and amphitheaters and sporting schools and naked wrestling and Jews, apostate Jews, they even started making foreskins so that they could wrestle naked. Well, of those four kingdoms, there were two kingdoms, there was a kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. They were the two most important ones. There was one kingdom in Turkey and one in Greece, but the kingdom of the north, that was Syria and Persia, Iran and Afghanistan, that was all the kingdom of the north, which is named the Seleucids. They governed there. And most of the kings were called Seleucus or Antiochus. And Israel was a buffer state to the kingdom of the north, which was Egypt, and that was ruled by the Ptolemies, because the first king, the first general who made himself king was Ptolemy I. And the names that are dominant in the south were Ptolemy and Cleopatra. And the one we know was Cleopatra the 7th or the 8th, I don't know. So there were dominant names there. And then in the north it was Seleucus the first, Seleucus the second, and Antiochus the first, and Antiochus the fourth is the very important one. All of Daniel 11 is about the wars from 323 till 165 between the king of the north, the Seleucids, and the king of the south, Ptolemies. And this is important because Israel was in between, and it was part of king of the south, but Antioch the fourth, this evil king, he conquered the Holy Land and started suppressing the Jewish religion. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a very bad king, and he came to power in Syria in 175 BC and he ruled till 164 BC. Well, the Antiochus IV, he is in the Bible as well, not named by name, but he is in Daniel. Let's go to Daniel 8 verse 20. As for the ram which you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the he-goat, he is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king, Alexander. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, those were four generals, and they started fighting and they made themselves kings, and the four kingdoms came out of this Greek empire of Alexander the Great, four smaller kingdoms. And the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms, four diakai kingdoms, shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their rule, when the transgressors have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance, one who understands riddles, shall arise. This is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His power shall be great, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he, Antiochus IV, does, and destroy mighty men and the people of the saints, the Jews. He shall destroy the people of the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, by deceit, because he was not the rightful heir, and in his own mind he shall magnify himself. Yeah, he made himself God. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the Prince of Princes, against God, but by no human hand he shall be broken. He died suddenly by illness in 164 BC. This Antiochus IV is also mentioned in Daniel 11, and Daniel 11 verse 21 till 35. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, Antiochus IV, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And he shall return to his land with great substance, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. In 169 BC, Antiochus IV plundered the temple. At the time appointed he shall return to his own kingdom after he had been battling with the south, and come into the south. And he shall turn back from his fight, and he be enraged and take action against the holy covenant, against the Jews. He shall turn back and give heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. Yeah, there were apostate Jews. There were a lot of Jews that were enamored by this Greek culture. So they started making foreskins. They started wrestling naked. They started building theaters and amphitheaters and I don't know what, and sporting schools. And they were apostate, and they fell away from their religion. And Antiochus IV, he encourages them and he goes towards them. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the continual burnt offering. Yeah, the continual burnt, the daily sacrifice for the Lord was actually stopped. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Yeah, in 168 BC, an idol of Zeus Olympius was set up in the temple. So, the daily sacrifice was stopped, and an idol in honor of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, was started. He started actually sacrificing pigs as well, instead of sacrificing clean animals. He shall, and of course that's a great disaster. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. So he will seduce the apostate Jews. When they fall, they shall receive a little help. And so there will be a little help for the people, for the Orthodox Jews, for the faithful Jews. There will be a little help, and that little help, that is the priest Mattathias with his 5 sons, the Maccabees, because they're named after Judas. That was the most important son, the one who was the best in fighting and having this guerrilla warfare, and he was called Judah HaMaccabi, Judah the Hammer. And that's where the name comes from, the Maccabees. And they started a guerrilla warfare against the Greek, against the Seleucids. So this Jewish religion was suppressed. We can read about that in the book of Maccabees. In 1 Maccabees 1, we get a vivid description of how the Jewish religion was suppressed. 1 Maccabees 1, verse 41. Antiochus now issued a decree that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. Yeah, he enforced this Hellenism, so he started enforcing it. It was not just voluntary anymore. He enforced it. You were not allowed to stick to your own. You should abandon your own customs. All the Gentiles and even many of the Israelites submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion, offered sacrifices to idols, and no longer observed the Sabbath. The king also sent messengers with a decree to Jerusalem and all the towns of Judea, ordering the people to follow customs that were foreign to the country. He ordered them not to offer burnt offerings, grain offerings, or wine offerings in the temple, and commanded them to treat Sabbaths and festivals as ordinary work days. They were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were commanded to build pagan altars, temples, and shrines, and to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals there. They were forbidden to circumcise their sons and were required to make themselves ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the law which the Lord had given through Moses and would disobey all its commands. The penalty for disobeying the king's decree was death. And then further, on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, King Antiochus set up the awful horror on the altar of the temple, and pagan altars were built in the towns throughout Judea. Pagan sacrifices were offered in front of houses and in streets. Any books of the law which were found were torn up and burned, and anyone who was caught with a copy of the sacred books or who obeyed the law was put to death by order of the king. Month after month, these wicked people used their power against the Israelites caught in the towns. On the 25th of the month, these same evil people offered sacrifices on the pagan altar erected on top of the altar in the temple. Mothers who had allowed their babies to be circumcised were put to death, in accordance with the king's decree. Their babies were hung around their necks, and their families and those who had circumcised them were put to death. But many people in Israel firmly resisted the king's decree and refused to eat food that was ritually unclean. They preferred to die rather than to break the holy covenant and eat unclean food. and many did die. And we will also see they are mentioned in Hebrews 11. In his anger, God made Israel suffer terribly. Then about the Maccabees, Wikipedia says about the Maccabees, in the narrative of 1 Maccabees, after Antiochus issued his decrees forbidding Jewish religious practice, a rural Jewish priest from Modi'in, Mattathias, the Hasmonean, sparked the revolt against the Seleucid Empire by refusing to worship the Greek gods. Mattathias killed a Hellenistic Jew who stepped forward to offer a sacrifice to an idol in Mattathias' place. He and his 5 sons fled to the wilderness of Judah. After Mattathias' death about 1 year later in 166 BC, his son Judah Maccabee led an army of Jewish dissidents to victory over the Seleucid dynasty in guerrilla warfare, which at first was directed against Hellenizing Jews, of whom there were many. The Maccabees destroyed pagan altars in the villages, circumcised boys, and forced Jews into outlawry. So there was a religious warfare. The term Maccabees, as used to describe the Jewish army, is taken from the Hebrew word hammer. And the Maccabees, they are mentioned in Hebrews 11, because it starts with Abraham, Enoch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Moses. And then he says, I don't have time to talk about Samson and Jephthah and Barak and the Hebrew writer just starts writing in general terms, and it's all chronologically. So the end of Hebrews 11 is about the time between the 2 testaments. So it's he says there in verse 32, "What more shall I say? For times fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, Samuel, and the prophets." And then he says in general, some were tortured, refusing to accept release that they might rise against to a better life. And then verses 37 to 38 are specifically about the Maccabees. Others suffered mocking and scourging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And we find that described in the book of Maccabees, but they had this guerrilla warfare. Well, after this guerrilla warfare, after about 3 years, the temple was reconquered, cleansed, and rededicated. And the rededication and dedication of the temple is always 8 days. It was 8 days for the tabernacle. The dedication of the tabernacle, that's described in Leviticus 8 and 9. And the dedication of the temple of Solomon, that was 8 days. And also the dedication of the temple of the millennium, which is described in Ezekiel 40 to 48, that also will be 8 days. So the dedication of the altar, the dedication of the temple is always 8 days. And that has nothing to do with the flask of oil that was found, because that is just a legend which was added 500 years later. That legend is not found in 1 Maccabees, not in 2 Maccabees, not in the writings of Philo, not in the writings of Josephus, not in the New Testament, not in the Mishnah. But after 500 years, in the Gemara of the Talmud, there's just one line that the flask of oil was found. But it's just a legend. The 8 days, the celebrating of the 8 days is because that the rededication took 8 days, because a dedication is always 8 days. And the word Hannukkah, is in Hebrew in the Bible when there is this dedication. So Hanukkat HaMizbech, the dedication of the altar, is in the Bible 8 times. Not by chance, of course, that it's 8 times in the Old Testament. That before there was actually the Maccabees, because the Maccabees are, of course, in between the First and the Second Testament. But the Hebrew word dedication is 8 times in the Hebrew Bible. Well, in the second and the third chapter, there's lots of battles between Judas and the Greek, and then in 1 Maccabees 4, they come to the temple. Judas and his brothers said, verse 36, 1 Maccabees 4, verse 36. Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been defeated, let's go to Jerusalem to purify the temple and rededicate it." So the whole army was assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the temple abandoned, the altar profaned, the gates burned down, the courtyards grown in a forest of weeds, and the priests' rooms torn down. In their sorrow they tore their clothes, cried loudly, threw ashes on their heads, and fell face down on the ground. When the signal was given on the trumpets, everyone cried out to the Lord. And then they start cleaning the temple and getting rid of all the dirt and cleaning everything, and restoring everything. And once they've done that, then they have time for the rededication. Verse 50. They burnt incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and there was light in the temple. Verse 52 to 54. The 25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev, 164 BC, was the anniversary of the day the Gentiles had desecrated the altar. On that day, a sacrifice was offered on the new altar in accordance with the law of Moses. The new altar was dedicated and hymns were sung to the accompaniment of harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and worshipped and praised the Lord for giving them victory. For 8 days they celebrated the rededication of the altar. With great joy they brought burnt offerings and offered fellowship offerings and thanks offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and shields, rebuilt the gates and the priest rooms and put doors on them. Now that the Jews had removed the shame which the Gentiles had brought, they held a great celebration. Then Judas, his brothers, and the entire community of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar, and the rededication of the altar had taken 8 days, that the rededication of the altar should be celebrated with a festival of joy and gladness at the same time each year, beginning on the 25th of the month of Kislev and lasting for 8 days. So this dedication of 8 days, the rededication of 8 days, they said we're going to celebrate that every year from the 25th of Kislev, because the rededication started on the 25th of Kislev. And the dedication always takes 8 days. We see this in Leviticus 8 till 9. There's 8 days for the dedication of the altar, of the tabernacle, and the dedication of Aaron and his sons. And then on the 8th day, God, fire comes from the sky, and God, he consumes the burnt offering on the altar, just like in the days of Elijah. And it says here in Leviticus 9 verse 24, and fire came forth from before the Lord, because the glory of the Lord was in the tabernacle, and consumed the burnt offering and the fat upon the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and they fell on their faces. So there was the 8 day, and then it says in Hebrew, Chanukah HaMizbeach. This is the 8th day of the dedication of the altar, and on the 8th day, God consumes the burnt offering on the altar. And we also see this in 2 Chronicles 7 verse 9 with Solomon. Solomon dedicates the temple on the Feast of Tabernacles and the 8th day. So he takes those 8 days of Sukkot and uses them for an 8-day dedication of the temple. So they coincide. And on the 8th day, after the 7 days of Tabernacles, they held a solemn assembly, for they had kept the dedication of the altar 7 days and the feast 7 days. And the dedication of the altar, and it says there in Hebrew, Chanukah HaMizbach. Chanukah HaMizbach. The Hanukkah of the altar, the dedication of the altar for 7 days. Yeah, the dedication is always 7 days. You know, the cleansing and the purifying is 7 days. And on the 8th day, then it starts working. Then the first sacrifices of the working of the cleanse are started. So we see this also in Ezekiel 43. Ezekiel 43, verse 25 till 27. This is the temple in the millennium, the temple of Ezekiel. For 7 days you shall provide daily a goat for a sin offering, and also a bull and a ram from the flock without blemish shall be provided. 7 days shall they make atonement for the altar and purify it, and so consecrate it. So purification and consecration and dedication is 7 days, and then it actually starts. You know, it's actually the work starts on the 8th day, which is here in verse 27. And when they have completed these days, then from the 8th day onward, the priest shall offer upon the altar. So the sacrifices of the people and sacrifices for the people, that starts on the 8th day. The first 7 days are just sacrificing to purify the altar itself. And so from the 8th day onwards, the priest shall offer upon the altar your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, and I will accept you, says the Lord God. And it says another translation, and I will take pleasure in you, and I will accept you. So yeah, it's always 7 plus 1. You know, the feasts are in Bible. The 8 is always 7 plus 1. We have 7 days of unleavened bread plus 1 Passover day. That's 8 days. We have 7 days of tabernacles plus the 8th day is 8 days. And we also have 8 days for the Feast of Dedication for Hannukkah. This word Hannukkah, is 8 times in the Old Testament. For instance, in Numbers 7 verse 10, and the princes offered for dedicating of the altar in the day that it was anointed. Even the princes offered their offering before the altar. And the dedicating of the altar, it says then Chanukot HaMizbach. Chanukot HaMizbach. And this is mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4 times, 4 times, 5 times in Numbers, and in 2 Chronicles 7, and in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. I've already read that. That's the dedication of Solomon's temple. And Nehemiah 12, we have the dedication of the wall. It says that Chanukat Chomat Yerushalayim, the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, and it's mentioned there twice. And we also have a psalm, Psalm 30, a psalm, a song at the dedication of the house of David. It says Chanukat Habayit, Shir Chanukat Habayit, a song for the Hanukkah of the house, a song for the dedication of the house. That's a Psalm of David, which was made for the dedication of the temple. The temple is important. It's important to Yeshua. If these things, and then we come to the crux of the problem, to the importance. In Jewry, the feast is important, and has especially importance for the present Jewish state. Because in the present Jewish state, Jewry, the Zionists, they started fighting against their enemies. And Judaism had been very docile and did not have an own state. But in the past 75 years, in the past 73 years, the Jews have had their own state. And Zionism is quite militaristic. So they look back on this fact that the Maccabees, they were able to defeat the Greek. But from a theological point of view, it doesn't make much difference whether that temple had been destroyed then forever or not. Because, if we haven't had a temple for 2,000 years, and if the Maccabees hadn't been able to rededicate the altar, there wouldn't have been a temple for 2,200 years. What's the difference? 2,000 years or 2,200 years? There's not much difference for the theology of Judaism that the temple wasn't there, because if there's no temple for 2,000 years or 2,200 years. But the thing is, it's important for us Christians, because Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, he had to come to that temple. He was there all the time. Now afterwards, once he had been there, 40 years later, the temple was destroyed. So it was important. It's important for Yeshua. Yeshua, he was redeemed. Jesus was redeemed in that temple when he was 40 days old, a day older, because Mary had to be there, and that was after her purification. Her purification lasted 40 days. So Yeshua was 41 days, or 50 days, I don't know. But he was there for his redemption. As a 12-year-old, he was in the temple, and he was discussing scripture with. He was discussing with the scribes, and later he cleansed the temple from trade, because the trade had come into the temple, and he cleansed it from the trade, and that's in John 2, and he taught daily in the temple. That's in Luke 19. And he called the temple his Father's house. That's in John 2. And he was there with Passover, for the 8 days of Passover and unleavened bread. That's in John 2. And he was there with the tabernacles, with the 8 days of tabernacles. And that's in John 7. And he was there with the Feast of Hannukkah, the 8 days of Hannukkah. And that's in John 10. So the major festivals, he was there. And it's important because it's a prophecy. It's a prophecy in Micah 3 verse 1, which had to be fulfilled, which means he could not come to a temple with Zeus, with a statue, with an idol of Zeus in it, and with pig's blood. That would have been completely impossible for the Messiah to come to a temple like that. So the temple had to be cleansed and had to be rededicated by the Maccabees. And they were led by God to do so, because it was prophesied in Malachi 3 verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger to prepare the way before me. The messenger, John the Baptist. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. That's Jesus Christ. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. He came to his temple when he was a baby, 40 days old. When he was 12 with his parents at Passover, and as an adult he was there with Passover, with tabernacles, and with Hanukkah he was there. The messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. So there was never the glory of the Lord was there at the dedication of the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord was there of the dedication of the Temple of Solomon. But the glory of the Lord was not there at the dedication of the temple, when the temple of Zerubbabel and Joshua, or 60 years later at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. There was no glory of the Lord present, because the Lord would come to his temple in the person of Jesus Christ. And he did, and that's why the temple had to be there. And that's why it's so important for us Christians that was the case. Because Jesus Christ, he went to the temple as well at the Feast of Dedication. It says in John 10 verse 22, it was the Feast of the Dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. Yes, so that means he celebrated it. If you are against that party, if you're against the Feast of the Dedication of the temple, you don't go to the temple. You stay in Galilee because you don't want to celebrate that. You say that's a festival I don't want. It's a festival which is not. It's not in the Torah. It's not in the Tanakh. So I don't want to celebrate it. Well, then you don't go there. But if you go there and you walk through the temple during the dedication of the temple and during Hanukkah, that means that you're celebrating it. That means you're in harmony with it. And of course, he saw the importance of it. And the thing is, there were about 50 to 100 ancestors when Judas the Maccabee, when he said, from now onward, all of us, we're going to celebrate that. That means all the ancestors of Jesus, they had celebrated it. You know, it's his parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents. And if you go on, and at the time of the Maccabees, there were about 50 to 100 ancestors of Jesus alive when that festival was instituted. So he celebrated it, and that's why I want to celebrate it, because my Lord, Jesus, celebrated it, and so I want to celebrate it too. And he has discussions when he is there at the Feast of Dedication. And in these discussions, the Father is mentioned 8 times. So the number 8 is there again. The Father is mentioned 8 times. And his, you know, his name in Greek, in the Greek Bible, in the Greek New Testament, is Jesus. And Jesus, if you add up all the letters, because every letter has a value, just like Hebrew, if you add up all the letters, his name is 888, 888. And he celebrated the 8 days of unleavened bread and Passover, and he celebrated the 8 days of tabernacles and the 8th day, and he celebrated the 8 days of Hannukkah, because he is the 888, and he celebrated all these festivals. So there is a great importance, because if the temple hadn't been there for 2,000 years or 2,200 years, well, it was important. Christ, he had to come to that temple. That's why it had to be cleaned. That's why it had to be proper. That's why the shoes had to get out, had to be banned. And that's why all the pig's blood had to be cleaned. And that's why it was important, because the Messiah was to come to that temple. And it was a great attack on the Jewish people, on the Jewish religion, and God stopped it. God stopped Satan, just like he did at the time of Purim, at the time of Esther, just like he stopped Herod by taking his son into Egypt. There are 3 great attacks of Satan. There's at the time of Purim, at the time of Hanukah, and by Herod the Great, that he tried to stop the coming of the Messiah. But the Messiah, Jesus Christ, did come. Amen.